Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tricycle's 30th anniversary celebration. I'm James Shaheen, Tricycle's editor-in-chief. This is the last live session in a series that we've been hosting over the last several weeks. Today's session will be recorded for anyone who is unable to attend live, so you can tell your friends that it's at our YouTube channel, which will be posted in the chat right now. It will be posted again, so if you miss it, you can always find it again. We are providing these events for free, so if you haven't already and would like to support Tricycle, please consider giving at the donation link in the chat. We will have some time for Q&A with our guests toward the end of this hour-long session. You can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can. Our guests today are Ayo Yetunde and Zenzele Isoke. Pamela Ayo Yetunde is a co-founder of Buddhist Justice Reporter, an engaged Buddhist human rights and social justice project. And I should mention they've been partnering with us. She is the co-editor of Black and Buddhist, What Buddhism Can Teach Us About Race, Resilience, Transformation, and Freedom, and is a pastoral counselor and chaplain with Center of the Heart. I should also mention I did a podcast with Ayo and her co-editor, Cheryl Giles, and you can go to tricycle.org and look at our podcasts if you want to know more about Black and Buddhist. Zenzele Isoke is Associate Professor and Chair of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. She has practiced meditation since 2005 and has been a member of Common Ground Meditation Community since 2014. She is the author of Urban Black Women and Politics and the Politics of Resistance. Zenzele also leads BIPAC meditation in North Minneapolis. I should say that these are truncated bios, the credentials go on, but we thought for the sake of brevity, we would cut them back a bit. Among other things, Ayo and Zenzele will be discussing Buddhist Justice Reporter's work. You can check out their coverage at tricycle.org/BJR. That link will also appear in the chat. Maybe one of them can tell you how you can support the project. So we're going to listen to our guests in conversation. I'm going to leave and then I'll return to ask questions you put in the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. So for now, I'll disappear and we'll enjoy a conversation between Ayo and Zenzele.
Thank you, James. And thank you to everyone and all the causes and conditions that brought Tricycle, the Buddhist Review, into being. Happy 30th anniversary. And on behalf of all of us who are engaged with Buddhist Justice Reporter, we thank you for your support. Zenzele, do you want to say something?
Sure. I just want to, just an expression of gratitude for all the work that's happened in between these two networks of Buddhist Justice Reporter and the BIPOC practitioners that comprise Buddhist Justice Reporter, and also for the Tricycle Foundation for supporting us and giving us access to a larger audience. All the work that we do together makes such a huge difference in my heart, and I know that it impacts others. And so, I'm just glad to be here today. And a shout out to all the participants from all over, everywhere, who have joined us on this call today.
Thank you, Zenzele. And also I want to express gratitude to everyone who's here, and also to my friend Zenzele, who I met when I moved from Atlanta to the Twin Cities, and was part of a group of practitioners from Common Ground Meditation Center who invited me into the center to meet them, and Zenzele literally and figuratively wrapped her arms around me and said, in essence, I'm going to take care of you while you're here. So thank you, Zenzele.
And thank you. I should also say, if we have a tiny bit of a love fest going on, Ayo is a beautiful mentor and friend and has just encouraged me through so many dark places, and just encouraging me with that self-confidence of reflecting on the goodness of what we have to offer. And Ayo has done that for me as a friend and has been a bedrock of my practice through so many just different kinds of ups and downs of living here as a Black female in the Twin Cities. So Ayo, I miss you so much, but I'm glad that we have Zoom. Thank you, Ayo, my good friend.
Thank you, friend. I was thinking, anniversaries, like 30-year anniversaries are or something that I usually celebrate. It's like, I love it. I love birthdays. I love graduations. I love anniversaries. And also, this happens to be the 30th anniversary year of the beating of Rodney King 30 years ago in Los Angeles by 4 police officers who some say he was beaten with batons upwards of nearly 60 times, unarmed and filmed. And it was seen by many. The police officers were acquitted, and the LA riots of 1992 broke out. Fast forward today, even though the police killing of George Floyd ended in guilty verdicts, which is highly unusual. My question to you, Zenzele, has much changed over the last 30 years as it relates to police violence against unarmed Black people?
Yeah, thank you for opening with that memory and that history, Ayo. So in 1991, I was a junior in high school in Long Beach, California. And, I just remember the kind of anger and dread that was felt as a result of the acquittal of all of those officers. And it literally sparked into a rebellion, like Los Angeles Rebellion. And fast forward to spring of 2020, May of 2020, it's just about the same time, 30 years. I'm here in the Twin Cities and hear about George Floyd and saw that video, and then immediately sparked something in my body, in my spirit. And it sparked something for everyone, because that rage and that anger and even that sense of dread pulled something out of all of us to say no more. To answer your question, has anything changed? I would have to say not much. As a matter of fact, I think from 1991 until this time, things have actually gotten worse, because in 1991, we weren't dealing with such a fierce backlash against progress in racial justice and progress in and having particularly people of African descent here in the United States, African Americans, Black people, being incorporated into, the larger culture. We had Barack Obama as president, but we didn't have a Donald Trump in 1991. We didn't have hyper-nationalism and such a huge proportion of our population armed and ready to fight in 1991, from my memory. So I would say we've made progress, but we've also at the same time have taken several steps back without having done the fundamental work of undoing kind of the history of anti-Blackness and systemic racism in the US. And so I really don't feel like much has changed, to be honest. While there are some great stories of individuals, collectively, as Black people in this country, things have not gotten much better for us. Poverty rates haven't changed. Employment rates haven't changed. Incarceration rates have sprung up though, right? And so we're dealing with I would say even more trauma. How is that possible in 2021 than in 1991? Mm-hmm. So that's a short and a long way. The short answer is no, not much has changed. And in many ways, things have gotten much worse than they've ever been.
Right, and I agree with you on every count. I agree with your assessment and the examples that you've given, and there are more examples that you can give. I mean, you didn't even touch on education. And of course, you didn't just touch on just the general attitude that we have towards each other. Everything from cancel culture to the attempted coup, very recent attempted coup. So things have gotten a lot worse on a certain level. And then I think about, well, what about the role that Buddhist practitioners have played in the fundamental work that you said has not been done? Has it been even addressed by Buddhist practitioners collectively?
I know that's a good question, but my kind of entry into formal Buddhism and the history of Buddhism is rather recent. It came as a result of a deep dissatisfaction with the way things were post-COVID, the tension, the busyness, the chronic loneliness, the addiction to screens. So it's new. What do you think, Ayo? How have Buddhists, what role have Buddhists played? I know we can think back to the role of Thich Nhat Hanh and other practitioners, but since you have such a richer history, Ayo, how have Buddhists allowed their voices to be heard and to resonate over the past 30 years, say beginning in the post-Rodney King era until now?
Yeah. I will say that I don't think I'm an expert in this regard, but I do know that at least 20 years ago, there was a gathering of people of color, Dharma leaders and teachers addressing these very questions within Buddhist communities. I don't know about the country at large, but at least within Buddhist communities. And that continues, right? We had a gathering in 2018 and in 2019. And then also individually, we're doing our work. And sometimes we get together in groups, smaller groups to do work. But when you say the fundamental change that needs to take place in the nation, I don't think that there are enough Buddhist practitioners to do the work by ourselves. And I look for opportunities for interreligious dialogue, as well as political engagement as a collective. So there's also Buddhist Peace Fellowship, and they've been doing work for decades. But the fundamental work, oh my goodness. I mean, you're talking about something, as someone said not long ago, the depth of the work that needs to take place in this country has been revealed. And it is overwhelming. And so, can we play a part? Is the question I have now is, what is the part that we can play to move the needle an inch towards this fundamental change that needs to take place? What can we do as Buddhist practitioners?
I think one of the big things to do is to allow our ethos of non-harming, of peace, of compassion, kindness, and gentleness. And in the Insight tradition, they talk about them as the Brahma Viharas. Those have to be ethos that are allowed to resonate out within the larger society. I mean, we live in a society where there's always, even in Sangha, sometimes competition and a desire to want to assert like a really kind of forceful, kind of yang presence and to do. But one of the jewels, I would say, of Buddhist practice is really learning how to open up space to allow peace and calm into our bodies and hearts so that that can resonate out into the culture. And one of the ways I think it's being done, and we can talk about this in terms of being Buddhist or just in terms of how mindfulness itself has kind of has made itself out into the mainstream. So we have the commodified forms of mindfulness that we might see in magazines to sell products. But at the same time, we have more and more people of color, and especially within Black communities, talking about healing and using meditation, sometimes mindfulness meditations and other types of somatic somatic healing modalities to actually become front and center of a justice-centered practice. Meaning if there is no healing, there's no openness, no compassion, and no real kindness, even for those who may seem completely different and antithetical to us, then we haven't kind of done much. But this is, I think, one of the beautiful seeds of what Buddhist practice has to offer this world in our workplaces. This morning, I was over on the bus to get my my second dose of the vaccine, and I was right over on Lake Street and maybe Lake Street and Minnehaha. This is an area that was pretty much in many ways decimated by the rebellions, the community rebellions that took place. And on the third precinct of the what used to be the 3rd Precinct police station, the police station where Derek Chauvin worked, there was a sticker of Martin Luther King. And it had like a long quote. I don't know the whole quote. I didn't know the whole thing, but what stuck with me was he said something to the tune of, we act as if there's a choice between violence and nonviolence. But he said, that's wrong. There's only a choice between nonviolence and existence. So meaning if we don't practice nonviolence as a culture in speaking, acting, engaging, we won't really survive. And we've seen this. So that's kind of what the role I think that Buddhism has to play in this world. And it has to go outside of the sanghas. It has to go outside of our meditation centers and our own personal cushions. But really these kinds of waves of energy have to be released out into the people who don't like, who get on our last nerves, and who are, antithetical to all we think that we say we believe in. Mm-hmm. So I would say that's one of the roles it needs to play.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I will say that I have seen you live like this. So I know that you're not just speaking theoretically. It comes out of your practice, or some people would say your praxis of bearing witness in silence, lotus position, in the midst of chaos. This is what you do, showing people that you can still bear witness, but do it in a way that is good for you and good for everyone around you. There's a certain, as a posture that you bring. And when you talk about spreading it out outside of Buddhist communities, I think I know the answer to this question, but I'll pose it anyway, because here we are celebrating 30 years of Tricycle, 30 years of Buddhist journalism, Buddhist writing, Buddhist essays, and so on, art. Can bringing a writer's bearing witness through writing about events related to justice making, is that a way that we can move the needle a little bit? And if so, how do you imagine we're doing this? Because Buddhist Justice Reporter, which we just started like yesterday, is in formation. Mm-hmm. It's in formation. So it's hard to say what it is, but what do you think it can be?
Well, Ayo, you are, I think you're a co-founder, but also like a principal to Buddhist Justice Reporter. And so it's interesting, because we think about Buddhist Justice Reporter, we're also thinking about the power of bipac sanghas, right? Sanghas, people who come together only for the sake of really meditating and being and witnessing and being present for each other's pains and joys. And so what Buddhist Justice Reporter allows us to do is it allows us to reflect back on this moment where there are kind of intense, I don't know why waves keeps coming at me this morning, but intense waves of anti-Blackness, anti-Asianness, and it gives practitioners the opportunity to, is supposed to shrink back from our Buddhist values and aesthetics and our ways of being in this world, but to put them front and center in order to analyze and critique what's happening in society, and as well offer some alternative pathways, right? This is what Buddhist Justice Reporter does. And what's interesting about Buddhist Justice Reporter is that there are so many folks who have legal backgrounds, such as your folks, educators, such as myself and Shannon Gibney, who maybe some of you guys heard of last week, public defenders, but also folks who are retired or who are young and who are just coming into their world. But as opposed to, and this is where I get a little political, as opposed to allowing dominant critiques of culture to be the framework upon which we build a collectivity or to build a platform like Buddhist Justice Reporter, what we're able to do is to bring our ethos and our sitting practices to inform the way we look at and the way we speak out into this world, which I think is a jewel. But Ayo, I have a question for you.
Okay.
Tell me why it's important for Buddhists to talk about justice and to put their ideas out into the public sphere. Why, and particularly ideas about justice.
Yeah, okay. For me, it's not even a question, right? For me, it's not even a question. Before I was a Buddhist practitioner, I was a person. I'm still a person. I was a Black person. I'm still a Black person. There's still violence. There are the things that are anti-Buddhist, like taking that which was not given to you. That includes a life. And you talked about some other things earlier, like we talk about there's miseducation. You can call that delusion, from a Buddhist perspective. When we say that we practice compassion and right action, then what is the compassionate right action towards someone or some community when you see that they are being pulverized, treated as second-class citizens, deprived of the nutrients for a healthy life? I was just thinking last night, this is the United States, right? We like to beat our chests about how great we are. Even though we have a different president now, at some point during the State of the Union address, they were talking about removing lead from water. And if you pay attention to how we live in this country, who's drinking that leaded water.
Yeah.
Black children. But the fact is that's still happening in the United States. So what is our response? Why do we go to Sangha and say we are about compassion and right action? And then when we get up off of the cushion, we just go about our daily lives. I mean, if we were teenagers looking at adults, teenagers are very good at pointing out hypocrisy. And so you talk about being political, I'm going to be theological. Okay. Do we just have our heads in the clouds as it relates to the lived experience of people who are perpetually targeted on the basis of race or caste or class, at any point? I think over the last 5 years, we learned that basically if you're not with them, then you're against them. And that means everybody else, right? So if we say we're about compassion and right action and all the other things we say we're about, loving kindness, you mentioned the Brahma Viharas. What is right action? And I think we already know. So really the question is, maybe the psychological, theological question is, what is it about our practice that actually prevents us from living into the things we espouse? And are we willing to examine that and let it go? What part are we willing to let go in order to live into who we say we are? And so Buddhist Justice Reporter can be viewed as a praxis or a practice for living out that what we say we are about. Bearing witness to suffering, attending to suffering, the transformation of suffering, and maybe even the inspiration for those who suffer to learn about the ways to transform that suffering.
Okay. Yeah, that's powerful, Ayo. And then as a question, and one of the things, so you asked, what do we need to let go of? And I'm gonna tell a story, and it's not gonna make my Sangha look too good, but I started practicing at Common Ground meditation, and there's like many meditation centers across this country. It's only me and maybe 2 or 3 other Black or even brown faces, particularly here in Minnesota. And we sit, we do our chanting, and we listen to the Dharma talk, and then there's a Q&A question. And I remember one time, this was about 3 or 4 years ago, someone asked a question, and I don't remember exactly what it was about, but I'm like, this person is the question was framed in such a way that it was colorblind, that it held no type of insight into the structural causes of because there was another police killing, to be honest. I think it could have been Philando Castile's. But there was just so much of a lack of understanding reflected in that question. And I looked around this predominantly white Sangha, and then understanding my demographics here in Minnesota, and that a substantial population, a substantial percentage of folks, even including the ones who go to Sangha, were actively kind of supporting our former president. And I said, well, that has to trickle into the Sangha. And so one of the things that I have an issue with within contemporary Buddhism, as it's expressed here in the Midwest, because that's where I kind of do most of my practice, is that it's built around individualism. That I can come and be in my own mind, in my own body, and practice this in my own, but it doesn't translate into social action. And that's a fundamental, I think, misreading and misinterpretation of Dharma. Because I think think about the principles of interconnectedness, and that's collectivity and connection and not individualism. And so if we are still holding on to individualist ethos that are related to capitalist consumption, including the consuming of Dharma and the individualistic consuming of Dharma, and not living our lives, driving our cars, having our homes, dressing ourselves, whatever we do, then we're fundamentally reproducing the conditions of suffering and adding 2, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th arrows to it, right? And so we have to be able to bring our practice, our ethos out into this world to say no to mass incarceration. We were on our cushions when they were locking up millions upon millions of Black people, over generations with mass incarceration. And now all of a sudden people decided we're gonna legalize marijuana, right? We're gonna legalize marijuana, and then we're gonna let people out. We're gonna decarcerate. But now the decarcerated folks are homeless, and they don't have anywhere to go, and they don't have nothing. They haven't been loved. They haven't been loved, right? So then what do we do? What do we do? And so we have to begin to think about our world, I think, in a way that allows us to really confront individualism, to confront capitalism, and even to confront the monotheistic interpretations of what Buddhism is, right? Buddhism is not monotheism. Buddha ain't God, man. Buddha believed in tree spirits, water spirits. He was indigenous. He was indigenous to the Indian land, right? But when we take this stuff up here, we combine it, we mix it and stir it into capitalist individualism, white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, and then we just go ahead and meditate. But no, that's not what's a word? It's not praxis. That's not compassion. especially when everybody else around you is dying slowly and not living well. So, Ayo, I had a question for you.
Oh, but wait, before you do that, I just want to, if
Yeah,
it's okay with you, I just want to say that you began saying what you said, like this may not make my Sangha look good, right?
mm-hmm.
You've got a couple of Buddhisms going on. Right? You've got a Mahayana head and heart in a Theravada culture. Yeah. Right? You've got that mixture. And so for the Theravada world, the insight world, to reconnect with each other, to find the value of relating to one another in a way that is nurturing is it's part of the work that we have to do to mobilize Buddhist practitioners to harness our power, the power of good positive power, good trouble, as Representative John Lewis said, get into good trouble. But in order to do that, it sounds like we need some reparative work to do around just relating to one another, which I'm willing to do. And as I think about what Buddhist Justice Reporter can be, we should probably address some of those things, the hindrances, right, to forming nurturing relationships that can begin to heal society. That's what I picked up from you.
Okay. Well, I couldn't have said it like that, Ayo. So tell me, Ayo, one of the things I really love and admire about you is that you allow your words to come from the universe to your mind and onto the page, and then you publish it and you put it out there. And no matter what the moment is, you're fearless around that. Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of providing a platform for people who are BIPOC, Black, Asian, Latinx, Indigenous, Buddhist, whoever, to be able to have access to the printed word and to larger communities? Can you talk a little bit more about why that's so important?
Yeah, yeah.
And in your work around it too, in your work around it as well.
Right. So we'll end our exchange with this exchange, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. But I'll say that we have to be the primary witnesses to our own lives. Mm-hmm. Clearly, right? Clearly, we have been talking about our lives, crying about our lives, showing evidence about our lives for centuries, and then for some decades, only for it to be denied over and over again, over and over again. For example, in the piece I just submitted for that I submitted for Buddhist Justice Reporter, the Tricycle published, I said even the prosecutor had to show that George Floyd had a birth certificate just to remind the jurors that this was a person who came through the same birth channels that everybody else goes through, because our humanity has been denied over and over. I mean, it's just part of living here. We are impervious to pain, right? Our skin is thicker, our blood is thicker. We don't need pain medication. People dying in the hospital unnecessarily. Recently, a Black doctor documented that she was not receiving what she knew she needed and died in the hospital. So if we don't document our lives, who will? That's one thing. Two, for this particular time, there has been an awakening by some people. And we know as Buddhist practitioners, awakening is a process. It's not a state, right? And so it is our job, if we want to live, if we want to rehumanize ourselves, let's put it that way, that we have to do the work of telling our stories regardless, right? Not being attached to whether anyone heard it. You tell it because it helps you stay sane. You tell your story. And so to provide a platform and to have this platform, Buddhist Justice Reporter, to have it supported by Tricycle is really astonishing. One, because we didn't even ask for it. It was offered just on the idea. That's incredible to me. And that tells me that that part has changed, right? So much of what we have to live with has not, but that part has changed. The opportunities for us to collaborate have changed. The technology has made it easier for us to collaborate. We are telling each other's stories as more people of African descent in particular, and more Latinx people enter the Dharma, just like the Dharma changing from India to Sri Lanka to Vietnam to China to Japan, Uganda, all this, it's going to be different wherever you find it because of the people who are attracted to it and become part of it. So why not create a forum for people of color to talk about or write about how the Dharma impacts them, how they see life as the result, and how does Dharma, if it does or if it doesn't, but how does Dharma help us deal with the existential threats to Black life? How do we do that? And that's what I hope BJR, Buddhist Justice Reporter, will do. Will do for folks. Do you have any last things you want to say, Zenzele, before we open it up for Q&A?
Well, I'm ready to, let's open it up and then we can continue talking. How about that?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you both very much. I'm back, as you can see. That was a nice conversation. And we're grateful to the contributions that Buddhist Justice Reporter has made to Tricycle, so thank you. And thank you for being here for our 30th. One of the things, I just had a quick question before we start with the other questions. This notion that in many ways things haven't changed. And while you were talking, I looked at an article from 1993 that we ran recently that Turning Wheel had published in 1993. And so much of the language is the same. The descriptions of the problems are the same. And it's sort of amazing that we're still here. But Tuare Salah said something. She's at Washington Insight, and she's also a member of BJR. She said something very interesting. She quoted a sign that she had seen during the protests, and excuse my language, but the sign said, "You fucked with the wrong generation." So something has changed, and she said something has changed. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the response to something that we have in fact seen before on video many times, when there was not the same response, was very different. And whether it had to do with COVID and lockdown or a different generation with different sensibilities and different levels of tolerance, how do you both see that? Because something changed. After all, without the world outcry and the attention that stayed focused on that particular crime, the murder of George Floyd, without that, you wouldn't have had probably a conviction. You might not have. We might have just stuck with the police report. So what has changed?
Zenzele, you want to begin?
Sure, I'll begin. I think one of the things that have changed is that these millennials, like the young folks who came up, they had to come up and live life in the midst of Reaganomics and extreme forms of neoliberalization, meaning the privatization of prisons, the move toward the privatizations of schools, the move toward the shrinking of the welfare state. So basically, folks had to grow up poor. And this is another thing, a lot of folks grew up listening to their children and taking care of their children instead of trying to put them into like a little box of conformity, because we were struggling when we grew up. So this younger generation, I think, had a vocabulary. They had a level of self-importance. It's good, a healthy sense of self-importance and a way to look at between what's right and what's wrong and access to information. This newer generation also didn't have to rely on police reports because the police would tell all types of stories about why they had to shoot someone point blank in the head or this, that, and the other. But we had access to media and cameras so that we can actually, that people can see what we have been seeing all over the place. And I think what's happened over this last generation, the past 20 years especially, white folks especially have had a mirror put up toward their own self by their own children to say, look at what you let happen, right? Look at what you didn't do anything about. So while you were doing whatever you had going to work, making a paycheck, taking out loans for new cars, this houses, this, that, and the other, contributing to a debt inside society, these young people were watching the violence that other generations were kind of protected from and shouted and in denial of, right? And so I think that's one of the big things that have changed. I think that whiteness itself has become problematized and thought of as a racial position, as opposed to something that's just, oh, we're all just the same, the kind of a colorblind kind of attitude. And I think that's one of the big things that have created change that we see in this world right now, this reckoning, as many pundits and folks have called it. Ayo, what's your thinking?
I have to get over your brilliance first before I can even put two words together. But your analysis is just, it's deep and it's wide too. I'll tell you what's changed for me. When I think about that statement, you've fucked with the wrong generation. That can be interpreted many ways. One way is that other generations you could fuck with. And that's not true, right? That's not true. There's an evolution of consciousness that all generations go through in order to get to this point. So this generation didn't get here by itself. It got here because of what other generations went through and prepared them for. That's one thing. But also technology, as Zenzele said, oh, we can document this. If I were to put a little placard up, I could say, we documented that shit. I could say that. And so, for example, in the closing arguments regarding George Floyd's murder, the defense kind of started the argument with, there's still a presumption of innocence. We must begin there. There's a presumption of innocence. Well, that standard occurred before we were documenting what went down. So how are you going to square a presumption of innocence when I've already documented your guilt, right? So this generation is like, oh no, we called it. We have the tools to call it. Now you, in a way, have a burden. The burden of proof is on you to say that didn't happen because we've documented it. And we could go on and on. My hope is, though, that those who have some generational issues, this is human development, right? Older people don't know anything. Younger people know everything, right? The way younger people do this, the way it needs to be done, the way y'all did it was that, that's obsolete. That we, as we go forward, that we come together across generations. And I will say that the way people showed up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the way people showed up throughout the world after George Floyd was tortured and murdered was what helped me be more hopeful that we are moving in the right direction.
Okay, the next question is a bit of a departure. Am I correct? Do I remember correctly that you also write poetry?
No, you don't remember that correctly.
Oh, I don't remember this correctly. Okay, then I'll think of Audre Lorde or someone like that. Bob Hansen asks about the role of poetry in a deep part of moving forward. Where have you found writing, especially in community, healing? And thanks for the wonderful listen.
Zenzele, I will just say that writing with Buddhist Justice Reporter writers is healing. We've gotten to know each other in a way that we didn't know each other before. We come together with a deeper purpose and mission. We're not just sitting. We do begin with a ritual, but then we get to the business of what's the content? What's the content for the next whatever expression of the writing is. I have written with other academics, and I do find that writing with other people tends to be a very joyful experience. I'm not a poet, but I have studied the poetry and the writings of Audre Lorde in particular, and I love poetry, but yeah, I'm not a poet. Zenzele?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I think.
hey, Zenzele, before you say anything, I'm gonna expose the fact, in case you don't say anything, that you are pursuing a master's of fine art and creative writing.
Yeah. That's my side gig. I have a paper that's due tonight, but but let me tell you something. I actually really love the question because I think poetry is an important tool for expression, and it's something that has to be made accessible. I mean, to everyone. I don't mean people who are trying to study creative writing, but I mean young people, because poetry is one of the ways in which we touch in to the heart. And like, if you think about Audre Lorde's poetry and her kind of thinking around Black femaleness through the lens of Black motherhood, thinking about like the poetry by the Buddhist nuns that have kind of come out, or Dojins, I don't know how to say his name, I just read it, poetry. But poetry is what opens up the heart. And I think that all of us need to move and explore and experiment on grappling with tough ideas through poetry and through opening up the heart and using the words to open the heart. So for me, I have a Black Woman's Fight poem that just came out, and I did my first poetry reading yesterday afternoon. So I think that studying, thank you, but studying poetry and really the way in which people like Earthlyn Manuel, I don't know if she would call herself a poet, since you are Earthlyn Manuel, but the poetic nature of her writings around In the Way of Tenderness and some of her other writing, I mean, that's what opens up our heart. Like Thich Nhat Hanh, his writings are, he can talk about washing the dishes and it'll just make you want to cry and make you want to do everything, slowly, how to eat, live. That's all poetry. That is, I think, the more beautiful aspects of Buddhism is really just to open up the heart and to tenderize the heart. And I think poetry is one of the ways in which that happens. That's like a deep radicalizing force. And I aspire one day, but yeah, I love that question.
Thank you. Marianne asks, and either one of you can actually answer it. Ayo, would you say more about what you mean when you said Zenzele has a Mahayana head and a heart in the Theravada culture?
I'll say briefly that based on my experiences in having my body in Insight and in Soto Zen and in the Plum Village tradition and in Shambhala, I've been immersed in all of those at some point. That relationship is an interdependence, are concepts and values that are talked about more in the Mahayana traditions and communities I've been in than in Insight. That Insight, coming largely from Theravada, is about individual transcendence. Individual. I practice, I experience enlightenment. If you go to a Thich Nhat Hanh retreat, for example, there's going to be a lot more relating. Small groups, and then the thought of interdependence. Interdependence has a lot to do with how we relate. But we don't talk about interdependence so much in Insight traditions. So that's what I mean. That's what I mean. Oh, and then I'll add this, that I learned a few years ago from reading one of my professor's articles. Her name is Dr. Carolyn McCrary. She is a womanist pastoral theologian. She said that the concept of NTU, like Ubuntu, into is interdependence. and that it is a cultural norm that has been passed down from generation to African norm that's been passed down from generation to generation to generation. So then when I did my research on African American Buddhist lesbians in the Insight tradition and asked them what they thought about the teachings on no self, they said interdependence, even though they're in the Insight tradition, right? And so that's what I mean. Interdependence, relationship, big in Mahayana, bigger in Mahayana traditions than in Theravada. And Zenzele happens to find herself mostly located physically in an insight space, but her mind and heart is around interconnection.
Yeah, and I'll just say it was, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead,
James.
Zenzele. I'm sorry. No, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say over the past, I think about beginning in really deeply in spring of 2018, and this is the power of technology. Like you can find all of Thich Nhat Hanh's Dharma talks and even the chanting that comes before it. You can find all of that online now by going to plumvillage.org. And so like certain things I would say that by studying Thich Nhat Hanh, but not more so than the reading, but to listening to his talks and his words and the way in which he forms them, and to talk about interbeing and that how we're inter-are. For me, it really gets us to like what folks have talked about, the heart of compassion, and how fearlessness and compassion are kind of like this. And I think that insight, and it's just a whole different, I'm not a theologian, so I can't say much. But I find that it's not only about achieving an insight of impermanence or achieving a particular awakening. It's really about learning to be in this world with everything else in a different kind of way. But there's some great questions here. So I don't know how we want to address those questions.
And just as one last thing, as Tuere reminded us in the previous conversation we had, that Thich Nhat Hanh said the next Buddha will be a Sangha.
Okay, now for a little bit of a practical matter, Carmen asks us to please make a list of BIPOC Sanghas available. There's plenty you can find online, but it reminds me of something that Zenzele said, and that was belonging to a Sangha where the vast majority of the people in it are white. Do you have any advice for BIPOC who say go to a Sangha, they walk in, they're one of the few people of color, one of the few BIPOC people, and they feel a little strange? Do you guys have anything to say about that?
Mm-hmm. I always defer to Zenzele first.
Well, first, you are strange to the white people. So the majority, I mean, you're different. You look different, you sound different, you probably talk different, you're different, my thinking. But my thing is when as practitioners, when we walk into a majority white Sangha, like, and I mean like 80, well, actually more like 90 to 96% white, we're dealing with a lot of aversion, and that's a hindrance to practice. And so I would recommend if you have a meditation center, find out what those BIPOC Sanghas are. I mean, those BIPOC groups, sitting groups are, and make that a core part of the practice. Because just going to, being going to a majority white, you can get the Dharma, you can get the message, but what you can't get is an interconnectedness. And you're also dealing with aversion by virtue of just really deeply rooted differences because of our trauma that's passed down to generation, our coping mechanisms. We are very different folks. And so you have to be able to get this around your own folks. Ayo, go ahead, and what do you have to say? I mean, you wrote an article on voluntary segregation in the book on Black Buddhism. So go ahead.
I did. And I would say this, that I'm less apt to sum up what the experience is in a predominantly white Sangha. But I will say this, that if a person of color enters a predominantly white Sangha, and there is that feeling of not belonging or strangeness, or you get that gaze, right? That like, oh, we've never seen you before, or you don't belong here. You don't really know what's going on in everybody's mind when they look at you that way. It could just be a moment of, oh, you are a stranger, and let me readjust so I can welcome you. Stay long enough to figure out what's going on. Stay long enough, because at a certain point, if this Buddhism takes, let's put it this way, takes, and you're like, yeah, this is a path for me, you will eventually be confronted with the teachings on non-discrimination. Right? And you will have a choice about whether you're going to embody that or not. Those teachings are for everybody. Mm-hmm. And so, just pay attention, try not to react out of conditioning. See if there are some friendly people there. There may be the opportunity to actually deeply connect with folks. And if you find after a little while that it's not a welcoming place, you are free to leave. Just as you were free to enter, you are free to leave. Yeah. That's my advice.
Okay, we started just a few minutes late, so we have time for one more question, and this is always a challenging question, I think. Joan asks, when offering metta, and that's loving kindness practice for those who don't know, when offering metta, how can one reconcile to those who are against what we wish for? How can we offer loving kindness, and must we offer it to all? It's not an easy one.
Dr. Z?
Well, I would say one of the biggest things, I'm one of those people, and they talk about I have a lot of aversion. And so some practicing metta formally was always pretty tough for me, but a lot of it has to do with, a history of not being loved the way I maybe wanted to be loved. And so I think in terms of, you first have to learn how to open yourself up to love your own self deeply, your own flaws, your own imperfections, your own gifts and talents. You have to be able to accept that metta, because it's only when you have a full understanding and acceptance and of your own kind of limitations that you can also at the same time be able to offer that out to other people. Right now, I feel like we live in a crisis of just misunderstanding. And misunderstandings create a lot of wars and conflict and just a lot. I mean, it's a lot of wrongness, but it's a lot of just misunderstanding. And so I think that in terms of metta, we have to be able to open ourselves up to our own kind of lovability. Because once you have that own lovability, then I think it's easier to offer it to those who may not want it. Because in the end, it doesn't matter if they want it, if they take it, if they feel it. What matters is that intention to put it out there. But that's what I would say. Ayo, what is your thinking on it?
Yeah. I'll thank you. I think you're right. And I'll just say briefly that through meditation practice, even before you get deeply into loving kindness, meditation practice is a way of letting go of clinging to personality, clinging to wounds, clinging to opinions. And when you can rest in that place, that already is a form of loving kindness, because you're not clinging to the impulse of defensiveness and aggression, right? And so just take your time with loving kindness meditation, so that, just take your time with it is what I would say. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. I wish we had more time to ask more questions that keep coming in, like about racism and capitalism and so forth. We couldn't possibly get into that with the limited time that we have right now. But thank you so much for those relevant questions. And there are many relevant questions like that one, which we didn't get to address. So thank you, Zenzele and Ayo, for taking the time to join us today. And many thanks to all our viewers. We have provided links to Buddhist Justice Reporters, I should say, at work in the chat. Many thanks to all of you who have joined us for our 30th anniversary series. It's finally coming to an end, and I couldn't have thought of a better way to end. As a reminder, we are providing this series for free, so if you haven't already and would like to support Tricycle, please consider giving at the donation link in the chat. There's also a link to BJR. Also, visit tricycle.org to see our May issue on Saturday. Our special 30th anniversary issue will be available in August. And thank you once more, Ayo and Zenzele. That was fantastic. It's such a pleasure to have you. And to all of our viewers and our guests, may everyone be healthy and safe.
All right, same to you. Thank you, James. Thank you, my beautiful friend Ayo. Love you much.
My friend. Thank you. Thank you.